webinar, which is a spin-off, as Berta mentioned, of the Torture Journal double special issue 2025 2 and 3, which is a special section devoted to Israel and occupied Palestine. And it's actually one of the most comprehensive collections that have been published ever on torture, genocide, and the psychosocial mechanisms that sustain them in the region. We are going to hear 4 strong presentations that are selected from this unique collection of articles. We're going to hear Samah Jabr speak about human rights-based analysis of torture against Palestinians as a tool of domination. We're going to hear Maha Aon present an epidemiologic profile of torture among Palestinians in Israeli prisons. We are going to hear Kathryn Ravey present a legal analysis of starvation as torture. And finally, we are going to hear Pérez speak about his editorial in this special issue, namely One Occupation, Two Realities, which is an overall comprehensive analysis of the conflict. Each presenter has a maximum of 20 minutes for their presentation. And I have to say, 20 minutes is not a lot of time. After each presentation, there will be a 5-minute Q&A session. And I again have to say, 5 minutes is not a lot of time. So it will maybe allow us to have 2 or maximum 3 questions for each presenter. We will now start with Samah Jabr, and Dr. Samah Jabr is a psychiatrist practicing in Palestine. She is serving communities in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and she was formerly a head of the mental health unit within the Palestinian Ministry of Health. She's an associate clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. In addition to her clinical work, Dr. Jabr has dedicated over 2 decades to advocating on behalf of the mental health care and well-being of the Palestinian people, focusing on victims of torture and trauma. She's the author of several books. And Samah will present her article, Torture as a Tool of Domination, the Logic Behind the Use of Torture. Samah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for this collaborative and important work that you have done. I'm happy to present the paper that I co-authored with my colleague Maria Elbish. Torture and ill treatment of Palestinian prisoners are integral to Israel's colonial domination. Escalation is reported since October the 7th, 2023, with widespread physical, psychological, and sexual violence, violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, including the Geneva Convention. Israel is party of the 4th Geneva Convention with ratifications and of the ICCPR and the Convention Against Torture. Nevertheless, systematic violations include arbitrary detention, denial of medical care, coercive interrogation, military courts, and are commonplace. Military courts circumvent protection under international humanitarian law via security classification. Over 20% of Palestinians are reported to be detained since 1967. There has been an escalation after October the 7th, where in the West Bank and Gaza, around at least 10,000 Palestinians are reported to be detained. Many of these people are women and children. There are many ways to criminalize Palestinians. Detention of activists and nonviolent actors is reframed as security threats. It aims to delegitimize political expression and resistance. It transforms political struggle into criminal conduct. Administrative detention is another big problem for Palestinians. It is detention without charge or trial. It is renewable indefinitely. 3,400 people were reported in March 25 as having administrative detention. 10% of these are children. It creates chronic uncertainty because of the renewability of it, and fear and loss of agency. This is a form of psychological torture. We'll talk about the psychopolitical logic of torture. Torture functions as a political instrument, not only for inflicting pain. It aims to dismantle collective identity and suppress resistance and erode dignity, and shapes subjectivity through fear and humiliation. It has started since the inception of the State of Israel and its military law. In 1987, Landau Commission legitimized moderate physical pressure, and despite a ban in 1999, coercive methods persist. Torture normalized within Israeli institutions and public discourse. There are many testimonies and that report on the patterns of abuse, and this includes widespread reports of electric shock, sexual assault, burns, and sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, forced nudity, denial of food and water and basic needs, hygiene. Patterns reveal systemic intent to degrade and dehumanize. Children as young as 12 are arrested, beaten, and held in solitary confinement. Denied legal counsel and family contact. This violates the UN Convention on the Rights of Child. And torture takes symbolic and performative shape. Some people reported that they were forced to kiss the Israeli flag or sing national anthems, and they were filmed. There is public humiliation with the diffusion of videos. It communicates a hierarchy of power between occupier and occupied, and reinforces domination through psychological degradation. Hunger strikes are another challenge. In May 23, Khadr Adnan was left in his cell until his death. He sustained multiple hunger strikes against administrative detention. It's a symbolic act reclaiming autonomy over body and narrative. Violent state responses reveal moral collapse and carceral systems, especially the threat of force feeding against Malta Declaration. There is medical neglect that is being used as torture. Some people reported that the doctors told them, "Talk to me when you die." There is denial of healthcare that constitutes cruel and inhuman treatment. Scabies epidemic in prison as deliberate neglect. There is medical coercion that is weaponized against detention, against detained people. Sexual and gender-based violence. Reports of sexual assault, threats of rape, and forced nudity. Every detainee was exposed to forced nudity and sexual insults. This targets both men and women to instill shame and destroy dignity, and reflects gender dimension of colonial power. And there is a spectacle of violence. Videos of humiliation circulate on social media. This normalizes torture and erases empathy and reinforces impunity and creates collective desensitization to Palestinian suffering. The psychological consequences are grave. There's complex traumatic reaction, depression, dissociation. Collective trauma affects families, injects guilt in parents and families, but it also intimidates the community. There is loss of trust in institutions and humanity itself. People don't file complaints because there is a sense of normalcy. what are the ethical responsibilities of mental health professionals and medical professions as well? Torture survivors need both healing and justice. Clinical neutrality can become ethical failure. Witnessing must integrate advocacy and documentation. Witnessing is political, relational, and moral. It requires empathy, courage, and institutional support. It transforms testimony into action for justice. But there are many risks: fear of reprisal, professional censorship, accusations of bias, burnout, and vicarious trauma among clinicians. There is need for solidarity networks and institutional solidarity to sustain ethical courage. The Istanbul Protocol has been a useful tool. It's a UN manual for documenting torture and ill treatment. It provides ethical and forensic guidelines for healthcare professionals. It strengthens credibility and accountability in documentation. It moves a critical human right-based approach to mental health moves beyond depoliticized clinical model and frames health as a right linked to justice and equity. It challenges systems that perpetuate oppression. We need a decolonial mental health praxis that recognizes collective dimensions of suffering, connects trauma to colonial structures and resistance, and promotes political agency and community resilience. Psychology historically is complicit in colonialism and oppression, and we must interrogate its own epistemologies and positionality. It requires transformation towards liberation-focused frameworks. We cannot depoliticize trauma in the case of Palestine, and wherever political violence is the major traumatic event. Conventional trauma models individualize suffering. In Palestine, trauma is politically produced, and healing demands political acknowledgement of injustice. Neutrality reinforces oppression. Solidarity involves moral courage and public advocacy. To witness is to resist impunity and dehumanization. We understand that we are facing structural and systemic violence, torture as expression of broader settler colonial violence. Accountability requires both legal and moral reckoning, and global solidarity is essential to end impunity. There are clinical implications for practitioners, and we need to understand torture as systemic, not incidental, and integrate trauma care with advocacy for justice and empower survivors through narrative reclamation. This requires a lot of training and advocacy and reporting. Documentation as path to justice, recording testimonies affirms survivors' dignity and transforms pain into political agency and supports future accountability mechanisms. In conclusion, torture in Palestine is a tool of domination and control. Mental health and health response must be political, ethical, and decolonial. Healing is inseparable from justice and liberation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jabr. We now have the opportunity to put forward questions, and we would actually prefer if you would use the chat box to ask for the floor, and we will then distribute it. We have a request for sharing the presentation. I don't know if that is possible.
Sure.
And I don't know either the technology for doing so. Maybe we can do that in the chat, perhaps. Until we have the first question, I would actually like to ask you, you mentioned this imposing national music, forced dancing to the anthem, and kissing the flag. It's something that we also see in Ukraine, that the Russians are asking or ordering the detainees, the Ukrainian detainees, to do. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit, what does this, which impact does this have the detainees, that they are forced, you could call it forced nationalistic behavior, perhaps. What is the impact here, and why is Israel using these methods?
For degradation, humiliation, and reaffirmation of power dynamics between the colonizer and the colonized.
That was very clear.
The impact is severe on people. These incidents produce a sense of shame and guilt. When I work with someone who was exposed to degrading practices like this, usually what I observe is that it's much easier for them to talk about the beating, the threats, the physical violence. These stories come much later in the therapeutic relationship because they produce a lot of shame and people are more reluctant to speak about them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jabr. And then Kathryn Ravey has a question. Kathryn, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Doctor. That was a fantastic presentation. My question was on, please do correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that sometimes, often, Palestinians who have survived torture and have been victims of torture, are often sort of asked to speak about that trauma as a way of as a form of advocacy, as a form of showing that this is a systemic issue, of sort of playing this perfect victim, of sort of providing some sort of reasonability as to why they were selected for torture. I was curious, sort of the effects on personhood and the idea of how torture sort of becomes performative in the Palestinian context in a way that often hurts survivors of torture. I'm not sure if that's a clear question, but I'd love your thoughts on this.
I have a different impression. I think that most people, of course, when people are released from prison, there is a public glorification for their sacrifices, in compensation for their sacrifices. And sometimes media is rapid to go and collect testimonies. But few people talk about this to media. And I think your impression comes from this, in my opinion, superficial process. What I want to say is that we are missing the professional documentation that can be done by health workers and mental health workers. And usually I've been meeting victims of political torture in two ways. Sometimes as a person documenting their experience, and sometimes as a mental health professional who receives people who don't come to talk about their torture. Usually, I receive a young girl or a boy with panic attacks. In the background story, there is a father who was released from prison who shouts when he's sleeping. And then we invite the father to come to attend for the care of his daughter. And if we establish a sufficiently trusting relationship, they will start talking about their experiences. So in my opinion, that the vast majority of people don't put their experience forward, don't talk about it, especially the experiences that produce shame. So what we are exposed to from media is it's the tip of the iceberg, is very little. What we can reveal in therapeutic encounters are much more deep experiences. And let me state forward, we don't have sufficient professional capacity for the documentation and for providing adequate and contextualized treatment for these people. And we need to build capacities in order to minimize the superficial journalistic testimonies on this topic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. There was one question in the chat from Anna Olson. Anna, would you like the floor and ask your question?
Can I ask now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wondered because sometimes young girls that I have met, they're so afraid of what their parents, especially the dads, the safe that they've been known, what they haven't been, what's happened, they have been sexually.
You're not going through very clearly. Your sound is poor. I'm afraid you need to start all over with your question.
Can you hear me now?
Not too good.
Okay.
Maybe I can read your question from the chat. Would that be fine? Because Anna asked the following, Samir. I would like advice on how to help girls who have been sexually assaulted by Israeli soldiers and who have been filmed. The girls are afraid of their parents' reaction if it becomes known to them. And that was the question.
Well, I think that they will feel embarrassed but not afraid, because I think everyone in the Palestinian society understands that this is the parents will be more angry with the Israeli community, not with their daughters, with the Israeli regime that inflicted the torture, not with the daughter. Of course, no one wants to be filmed or the film will be distributed. But I don't think that this is a big problem in the minds of people. The fact that it happened is the biggest problem. To imagine, I'm afraid that there is an Orientalist assumption in the question that the reaction of the parents is a bigger problem than the fact that this thing happened by the Israeli system.
Okay, thank you very much.
And how do we help them? I have to say that there are some NGOs that try to provide psychological support for these people, including Ad-Damir organization, which is a legal organization, but they also created support groups for and individual support for those people who had experiences that have severe psychological effects.
Okay, thank you very much. We have two more questions, and I know we can at least have time for the first one, maybe also the second. But the first is from Riyad Bouzid. So please, you have the floor, Riyad.
Merci beaucoup. Merci pour les organisateurs. Merci, Dr. Jabr. Vous avez parlé des professionnels de la santé qui doivent témoigner de ce qu'ils voient. Je voudrais poser la question, où on est actuellement, selon votre savoir, l'état du personnel de santé en Israël? Est-ce qu'ils témoignent? Est-ce qu'ils témoignent assez? Est-ce qu'ils ont peur? Est-ce qu'au contraire, ils prennent parti, comme dans certains pays ou certaines régions, pour les autorités? J'aimerais avoir votre avis et merci beaucoup.
Très peu des professionnels israéliens elles témoignent et elles participent dans le travail de document. Ils font la documentation pour ces expériences. Par exemple, les professionnels qui travaillent avec PCAT, Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. Mais la plupart, ils participent dans le système qui applique le contrôle et la domination du peuple palestinien.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Then we have time for the last question, which is from Mechild. You have the floor, please.
Yes, thank you. And I think there is really what you mentioned, no, that there is a lot of need to have more documentation. And in the documentation area, we are like in between the therapeutic services and the legal services. So my question is about the network we have. You know, there is IFEC for documentation. If there are more trainings planned or
Definitely there will be an effect if we train more local professionals and probably some international professionals who are interested and who have shown their professional solidarity with Palestinians to do more of the work of documentation and treatment. And on that occasion, I would like to just raise a question. Check the funding that goes for this aspect in comparison to the funding that goes for family planning of the Palestinian people, for example, or for domestic violence in Palestine. So the donation, the budget, the publications that are made minimize the importance of political violence and its impact, its psychological impact, and maximize the importance of internal Palestinian issues and problems. So we need to ask critical questions about this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Jabr, for an excellent presentation and Q&A session. We now move to the next presenter, Maha Aon. And Dr. Maha Aon is an epidemiologist and a public health practitioner. She holds a master's degree in public health and a PhD. She has more than 20 years' experience in international development and public health, and she has worked as a senior public health advisor at Dignity Danish Institute Against Torture as a very appreciated colleague to myself. Her work focuses on the nexus between human rights and public health, and her PhD research are more specifically on the health of incarcerated persons. Maha will present the article, What is There Left After Losing Oneself? 100 Testimonies of Genocidal Torture from Gaza. Maha, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Jens. Just a quick correction. I have 2 articles in this issue, but I will be presenting the one on the profile of and psychological effects of torture of Palestinians detained by Israel, and not the title you mentioned. So I hope you can see my presentation. I want to first acknowledge my co-authors who are listed here. And I think Dr. Jabr has really saved me a lot of time because she set the scene absolutely brilliantly, much better than I could have ever done, which means I will skip some of these. I think I just want to say that even though this study looks at Palestinians in prisons, we have to acknowledge that especially, but not only, but especially since October 2023, a lot of Palestinians are detained in military detention, and we do not have accurate numbers on all those people. But in terms of people detained in prisons, as Dr. Jabr presented, the numbers are around 10,000, but I just want to remind you that only 18% of those people are actually serving a sentence. And of course, all those in military detention are not serving any sentence. The International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion in 2024, noting that Israel's treatment of Palestinians amounts to segregation or apartheid. And Dr. Jabr explained very well this concept of administrative detention and the military detention and military law being applied to civilians. And I think Israel is the only country in the world that applies military law to children. And as she again presented, ill treatment and torture are not a new phenomena. So we conducted a survey. It was conducted by the Treatment and Rehabilitation Center for Victims of Torture that is based in Ramallah, and with technical support from Dignity, Danish Institute Against Torture. We used the sampling frame, which is basically a list of all Palestinians released from Israeli detention that is held by the Palestinian government. And TRC contacted everybody on that list who resided in the West Bank or Jerusalem. So now we're stepping a bit away from Gaza and looking at West Bank and Jerusalem. Everybody contacted was offered psychological support, and those consenting to participate in the study were interviewed face-to-face by trained therapists. We used a standard questionnaire that included demographic characteristics, facts about the arrest and detention, exposure to ill treatment or torture, self-reported psychological impact, and then also included questions about depressions based on the Beck Depression Inventory and questions about PTSD. 100 people agreed to participate, almost exclusively men, with a median age of 27 and a half. Women, and that does not mean that there weren't women and children released from Israeli prisons. It just means that these were much more likely to refuse participation because of fear of reprisal, and I'll come back to that point. Before I enter into the results, I just want to acknowledge the data collectors from TRC, the therapists, who worked under really harsh conditions. Very often during an interview, they would hear that a road might be blocked because the Israeli military may block a road, and it's a bit haphazard. People are not informed ahead of time. So the data collectors would have to end an interview early or cancel it, so to make sure they're not cut off from and are able to return to their homes. Also, there were risks of settler violence or military violence or army raids, and which again limited movement of the data collectors. First, I'm presenting the duration of detention of the people we interviewed. The median of detention was about 11.9 months, so about a year. And the biggest proportion was detained between 1 year and 5 years. So there's a bit of variation, but most were detained for a pretty long time. The time between arrest and permission to contact a lawyer or relative, which is, of course, the standard norm globally, is that when you're arrested, you are allowed to contact someone. Only 3% of the interviewees were actually allowed that immediate contact. The majority were not. In fact, 11% were never allowed to contact anyone until after they were released. And 34% was only after weeks, 40% was after months of detention. So we have a very real experience of incommunicado detention among our interviewees. This is a busy graph. Basically, we found that everybody we interviewed had been exposed to ill treatment or torture. We grouped the different ill treatment and torture methods according to the type. Of course, there are many ways to have a typology, but we tried to adapt it to the local context. So you'll see at the very top, the red line, that is sexual harassment. Then the lines in shades of green are those that we grouped as sensory methods. So for example, exposure to extreme heat or cold, or hooding and blindfolding so people couldn't see. The methods in shades of blue are other physical, so not sensory methods, like gunshots or strangulation or electrocution, or shaph, which is a form of suspension where typically a person can be tied by the wrists and suspended so that their entire weight of their body is borne by the wrists. And then the methods in shades of purple are purely non-physical. So for example, verbal insults, or like Dr. Jabr, for example, gave examples of kissing an Israeli flag, or being forced to sing, or mocking their beliefs, and so forth. So for example, if they're praying, then hitting them while they're praying, or joking about their religion. So these are purely non-physical methods. And then the methods in shades of orange are those related to deprivation, whether deprivation of medical care, hygiene, or so forth. So the main impressions are that, as you can see, there's a lot of different methods. And as you can see, the percentage of exposure is really high. The highest is food deprivation, where 99% of the interviewees said that they were either they were not given sufficient food, or it was not of edible quality. Then hygiene deprivation, 95%. That means that they were not given regular access to running water or soap or clean clothes or clean linen and bedding and so forth. 94% were exposed to beating. 93% were deprived of any visits, and so on and so forth. You can read the details in the paper, and the link is in the chat. A really important finding for us was we tried to calculate the median number of methods each person was exposed to, and that was 29. So the median of exposure per person was 29 different ill treatment and torture methods. Reprisals and threats, I think this is extremely important, especially given the question that was asked in the discussion, and the importance, and also some of the comments in the chat, the importance of documenting this torture and ill treatment. Before you start reading these bullet points, I want to go back to that list that I talked about, the population frame. That is a list of Palestinians released by Israel from detention. That list contained 270 people who resided in the West Bank and Gaza, but only 100 agreed to be interviewed for this study. And when you look at these bullet points, you will understand why. Although everybody experienced some form of ill treatment or torture from our interviewees, only 24 filed a formal complaint. And again, like Dr. Jabr said, it could be because it's normalized, but it could also be because they are afraid of the repercussions. 69% said that they were threatened not to report the torture or ill treatment. 83% were threatened with future detention if they engaged in political activity, and 68% were simply threatened with death if they engaged in political activity. So of course, it's no wonder that parents would not allow their children to participate and report on the torture. And I think, again, as Dr. Jabr said, it is really a minority that is speaking to the media about the torture, and we can understand why. This table documents the reported consequences of the detention experience. The top half looks at the physical consequences. 7%, had an amputation of an extremity. So they had a hand or a foot or leg or an arm amputated. This percentage it may look low, but it's actually very high. And one of the comments we actually got from the reviewers was about this particular point. I'll come back to it at the end of the presentation. 21% had a physical disfigurement, and 26% had at least one fractured bone. In terms of the psychological consequences, the table presents depression and PTSD symptoms. In terms of depression, only 12% had minimal or no symptoms of depression. The rest had some form of depression. All participants displayed symptoms of some form of PTSD. But in addition to depression and PTSD, there were other psychological effects. 56% reported that they had some form of personality change. 66% reported sleep disturbances, and 10% said that they have suicidal thoughts. So very severe consequences and experiences as a result, or not only as a result, but after the detention experience. This is a series of box plots where we basically tried to understand how people experience these torture and ill treatment methods. So we asked them to, using their own assessment, to assess to what extent it had a psychological effect on them on a scale from 0 to 4. So for example, we asked, when you were deprived of soap or running water, how bad did you feel about it? 0, this being no effect at all, no psychological impact, and 4 being a very high psychological impact. And as you can see here, the orange box is much higher than the rest. This basically means that people had felt a much stronger psychological impact of the deprivation methods than other methods. So for them, being deprived of soap or being deprived of knowing the date and the time impacted them psychologically much more than, let's say, the physical methods, the blue. Again, I'll come back to that, but that's really the point of this series of box plots. And we applied, we ran a few analyses to see if there was statistical significance of this. So we did a one-way analysis of variance and ANOVA, and it is statistically significant that deprivation methods had a higher psychological impact. And then we also looked not only on this more subjective measure of psychological impact, but also on the depression symptom levels. And using ANOVA, we found that depression symptom levels depended on the number of torture methods. So that the number really had an effect on the level of depression. But then we also ran a multivariable logistic regression and found that the higher the number of methods, the bigger the load of depression symptoms. So the key takeaways. First, everybody who was interviewed had been exposed to torture or ill treatment. Second, there's a median of 29 methods per person, very varied, very high number. And third, there are major immediate physical and psychological consequences of the detention and torture and ill treatment. Depression symptoms was among 88% of the samples reporting moderate to severe depression, and 63% reporting post-traumatic stress disorder, but everybody almost having some form of stress disorder. These numbers are much higher than what we have globally. So this was about the context for people released who live in the West Bank and Jerusalem who were released from Israeli detention. But I think we have a lot of lessons to take beyond Palestine. First of all, that depression symptoms post-torture ill treatment are not only a function of how harsh the physical treatment was, but also the number of torture methods, the type of torture methods, and the individual's subjective perception of the psychological impact. I think Dr. Jabr said it really well when she talked about humiliation. And we have numbers here showing that, yes, the sense of humiliation and disorientation played a very important role in determining the psychological impact. So being deprived of knowing the date and time or having trash dumped on a person affected them psychologically much more than being shot with a gun. And we can, go into details of how people scored. So for example, this shabh, the suspension that I talked about, which is known to be very physically painful, was scored as 2 on a scale of that could be a maximum of 4. Whereas not knowing the date and time scored a 3 on a scale of 4, so it scored more. So when we want to know how the methods affect people, it's not only about the physical pain. Very, very important also is to contextualize the torture and the ill treatment. It's likely that the reason that the depression and PTSD are high are, of course, probably influenced by the detention experience, but not only. People have been living under the continuous stress, and that is basically the occupation. So it's not as if they lived in heaven, they had a bad experience and they're going back to heaven. No, they live under occupation, they have a horrendous detention experience, and they go back to the occupation. And we need to pay much more attention to not only measuring post-traumatic stress disorder, but to this concept of continuous traumatic stress. And then going back to the issue of amputation, when I was with Dignity, we had done a research a review looking at the consequences of handcuffing, and we never found that amputation was one of the side effects. But we are seeing more and more, not only from this study, but from other research and other reports coming out of Palestine, that amputation of extremities is becoming a common consequence of prolonged tight limb restraint. And I think there needs to be much more examination of that. And again, as one person asked about the collaboration of doctors from Israel, and we tried to reach out to doctors from Israel to obtain medical reports to document and understand this amputation. But again, as Dr. Jabr said, the participation was very poor for many reasons. So I just want to thank these participants for sharing their experience and acknowledging their experience, and also gratefully acknowledge the TRC therapists who struggled to collect this data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maha. Much appreciated. Also by other participants, I can see. I would like to invite participants for asking questions by just mentioning it in the chat that they would like the floor. Until then, maybe Maha, could you elaborate a little bit, taking a point of departure, your very last slide. It's really, really hard work to collect data for quantitative analysis on torture under very, very hard conditions and difficult to get quality data. Why bother to do quantitative analysis of this phenomenon? What do you think it adds?
I think it's absolutely essential. I think that anyone who's been following the news knows that there is a lot of accusation that people are being emotional, or people are being biased, or people are being subjective. And I think quantitative data is essential when you want to show hard, non-emotional, black and white, objective facts. And that's why I think that, and of course it's very hard. It's even hard outside of a conflict situation to collect data on torture. Even in peaceful countries like Denmark, we struggle to collect this kind of information. So doing it in a very volatile context like occupied Palestine is of course extremely difficult, but I think it's absolutely essential and very important if there is any hope of retribution and restitution and accountability.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the, now it becomes a dialogue, but the participants are welcome to ask. But you mentioned that the deprivation methods were very abundant compared to others. Why is that, do you think?
I think, again, like Dr. Jabr said, I think the importance of humiliation as a result of the torture is very important. I saw someone write in the chat asking if torture can be tolerated if it's, for example, to get information about a potential terrorist plot. But I think it's extremely important in this context to show that the torture is not intended for any information. The torture is intended to humiliate people and degrade them and break them. And I think this has been shown in many, many contexts, not only in occupied Palestine, that the intention of torture is very often not to get information, but very often to break a person and break a community, or for revenge, or for many other reasons that is not to extract information. And I think that it's very clear when we look at the research coming out of Palestine, when we look at the media reports, that humiliation is definitely one of the goals. And sadly, it is also the one that has the highest psychological impact on the victims.
Yeah, apparently so. Now the questions are pouring in. The first one is Vincenzo Barca. So Vincenzo, you have the floor, please.
Hello.
Hi.
J'arrive pas. Voilà. In your research, did you find evidence of doctors or other professionals being involved in inflicting these acts of torture?
Should I take it one by one, the questions?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Vincenzo. So in this particular survey that I presented, we only interviewed the survivors. However, there's another paper also in that issue that I co-authored from Gaza, where we do have evidence of participation. Maybe it's not so, I hope it's okay that I delve into that, but yes, we have reports of doctors either refusing treatment or, and this is also corroborated from media reports and reports from other NGOs, or performing under conditions that would go against the Hippocratic Oath. So for example, the Palestinians, when they are treated, especially under military detention, they are restrained by the four limbs. So both hands and feet are tied and they're blindfolded while they are receiving surgery. Of course, if you think of, let's say, in Italy or France, no doctor would, or hopefully very few doctors would agree to perform surgery under these conditions. We also have reports of doctors themselves either insulting or beating detainees, but this is not in this survey that I presented. There's another study from Gaza in the same issue where we document this, and then of course there's elsewhere where that is documented.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Laurel Benhamida. Laurel, please, the floor is yours.
Good. Well, it's midnight here. My question is about beating on the soles of the feet. Is that used, and is one of the consequences of that can be permanent disability, inability to walk again without pain in the future. And we have reports in California of people from West Africa who have suffered that torture.
Yes, falanga is one of the torture methods generally reported, but in our survey, we did not have reports of falanga. We did have reports in other studies though, but in this particular survey, no, we did not find, that was not one of the methods reported.
I guess I would follow up by asking, were there methods of torture that were the purpose of which was to make a person unable to follow their profession? So for example, a person who works with their hands, a tradesman, for example, would the hands be the focus of the torture?
Unfortunately, I don't think our data was detailed enough for us to get that kind of information. But maybe there would be other reports from other NGOs. I'm thinking, for example, of a report by the NGO called B'Tselem. It's called Welcome to Hell, where they do report on such cases. But in this survey that I presented, we did not have data that was detailed enough for that.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. And the last question is from Lisa. You have the floor, Lisa.
Thank you. Maha, thanks. A really important report here. Among the variety of very important messages we have to take on as people working with torture rehabilitation and working to seek justice and to stop these horrible acts, I hear you talking a lot about the frontline mental health workers, in this case, TRC staff. What modalities would work best to better support these frontline health workers? What can we be doing? Samah talked about, global solidarity, but are there any other ideas you would contribute there? Thanks.
Yes. When I worked with Dignity, that was one of the major things we looked into. I know that, if I may, Jens, on behalf of Dignity, say that they are supporting TRC therapists, but also other NGO therapists who work with them. Having said that, it's not that simple. because, again, of this continuous stress that they are under. So I know that with one of the Palestinian NGOs that we used to work with, we asked if they would like to get psychological support. Those of them who had left Palestine wanted that psychological support and were receiving it. Those of them who were still in Palestine said that they don't want that support, but that they would rather get other kinds of in-kind support. So, for example, if they could get money to buy food for their children, that would relieve a lot of their stress. So we went into the literature and found actually that there is evidence that providing people with a small amount of money to get their basic needs actually may have, in some contexts, better results on their mental health than psychological sessions. So in that case, that was the kind of support provided. So I think it's very important, first of all, to ask people what they need. What is it that will really, and not assume that a session with a psychologist is the solution, but ask them, what is it that would relieve your stress? And then to work to try to support them in that way. So I think that's number one, is asking them what would relieve their stress. And second then is supporting them. But third, and of course that continues throughout, is again, not just putting a Band-Aid on the issue, but going to the root cause, which is the occupation. It's not only about documenting and giving psychological support, it's about ending the occupation, acknowledging the apartheid, so that we can make sure that these people are not under that continuous stress, but that it ends so that the healing can start.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you very much for this Q&A and for your presentation. Maha, much appreciated. We will now move to the third presentation. This is Kathryn Ravey. And Kathryn is a human rights lawyer with a Master of Human Rights Law. She currently serves as an international advocacy officer at the renowned organization Defense for Children International, Palestine, where she leads international legal and diplomatic advocacy to protect Palestinian children's rights. Kathryn has previously worked with Al-Haq and with Law for Palestine, and she's been contributing litigation strategies, evidence-based advocacy, and accountability mechanisms under international law. Kathryn has also served as a visiting professional at the International Criminal Court. Kathryn will present her paper, Starvation as Torture, Deliberate Hunger Violations Against Palestinian Children. And please, Kathryn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the other panelists for some tremendously fascinating presentations. Let me just share my screen. Okay. So I would like to highlight this study that is done on behalf of Defense for Children International Palestine. We are for those who aren't aware, we are a human rights based organization in Palestine, based in Ramallah. And for almost 30 years, we have documented human rights abuses of children, advocating for their protection of rights at international and national levels, and of course represent children in legal spheres, both within Palestine and externally. Our presentation, or our paper, talks about torture in a bit of a different sense as it's been previously talked about. The deprivation of food is perhaps one of the oldest methods of punishment throughout human history. And, usually we talk about deprivation of food in the context of detention, and I will certainly touch on that. But what we seek to do with this paper is essentially highlight that the intentional use by Israel of starvation against Palestinian people, and particularly children, constitutes torture under international law. So to kind of give us a broad understanding of where we're coming at this from, I think it's important to provide some context and some background. As many of you probably are aware, Israel has utilized its complete control over Gaza since 2007. So any sort of the restriction of goods and of any sort of free movement has been in place since then, and really well before then, but we can really document a true blockade from 2007 onwards. Obviously, after October 7th, 2023, this was exacerbated to a tremendous extent, imposing full blockades and sieges across Gaza, against Gaza, which cut off food, water, humanitarian supplies, electricity. And obviously, this is very much ongoing, even after this supposed ceasefire has taken place. And that this is essentially stifling any flow of aid and life-giving supplies into the region. Another important bit of context to understand is that what has gone into this prior to October 7th is that Israel has maintained a complete occupation and control of natural resources within Gaza. So this operates in many ways, and in the occupied West Bank, we can see this in regards to water, to minerals, to agricultural plantations, multiple ways. Within Gaza, Israel has long prevented Palestinian fishermen from utilizing the coast, from fishing, often attacking and killing fishermen, imposing restrictions on how far out fishermen are able to go. Along the annexation wall that sort of barricades Gaza is this thing called a buffer zone, which is essentially, kind of an ambiguous distance from that wall in which Israel imposes its occupation and its supposed sovereignty over the area. And they do this by essentially using aerial spraying and herbicides, which has damaged the agricultural fields that exist around that area. They have also attacked farmers and sometimes even conducted, chemical disruptions in the region to ensure that agricultural pursuits are essentially stifled. This also relates to water and the ability to, I suppose, keep desalination plants functioning. Which is, of course, I mean, what I'm ultimately trying to demonstrate is that Israel has used the control of resources to ensure that Gaza has remained reliant not only on foreign aid, but on Israel to provide and allow the facilitation and trade of goods coming into Gaza. Even in desalination plants that are often controlled by Gazan officials, much of the technology that is required for desalination plants, and indeed the electricity, is dependent on foreign companies. And of course, Israel itself for allowing those materials into Gaza. So you can already understand how this sort of context leads to a forced dependency on, I suppose, life-sustaining abilities within Gaza. So after October 7th, Israel very much leveraged this dependency and exacerbated this lack of self-sufficiency that was indeed imposed by Israel's occupation on Gaza. And it did this in multiple ways. Israel essentially attacked greenhouses, food warehouses, bakeries, agricultural landscapes. It used illegal chemical weapons, which penetrated soil within Gaza, rendering the land unfarmable for a long period of time. It essentially attacked life-sustaining functionality within Gaza. Desalination plants, electricity was cut off, those were run down. It basically completely cut off Gaza, rendering millions of people completely without aid and ability to sustain themselves using even the basic resources around them. And this is a very intentional plan by Israeli policies to ensure that Palestinians were completely reliant on external aid. Therefore, once Israel imposed its full blockade on Gaza, it just cut off thousands of people from any sort of life-giving ability. And this impact on children obviously is extremely profound, but resulted in very acute malnutrition and indeed starvation. And it is sort of our position in this paper that this amounts to an egregious act of torture under international law in imposing suffering upon an entire people, contrary to international law. I want to take a moment to talk about the scope of this, because I think one thing that we came up across in our publication was the difficulty in trying to quantify this. As you can imagine, the number of children in Gaza, I mean, people, of course, but children specifically who have been suffering from acute malnutrition and indeed starvation is quite difficult to follow amidst constant bombardment, displacement, and a general lack of on-the-ground awareness and research. Defense for Children International Palestine has field researchers on the ground in Gaza who have been working tirelessly throughout this entire period to try to document instances of malnutrition, of starvation. You can imagine the field researchers themselves struggle to move about, to document children, to find children, to follow up on stories, especially as hospitals and health facilities were under constant attack, and a lot of these children kept moving around. Or were moved. I will just briefly highlight some of the children that we were able to document. And apologies for sometimes the difficulty of looking at these photos, although I think it's important that we acknowledge sort of the impact that we are talking about, because many of the children we were able to document that were suffering from malnutrition had ongoing complicated medical dependencies. Many of the children that we did highlight became quite malnourished very rapidly. Of course, they had been experiencing acute caloric deficiencies in the months prior to March 2024, which is kind of when a number of our fatalities started to pop up. But they kind of rapidly deteriorated, and many of them experienced organ failure, malfunctioning of bodily fluids and processes, extreme fatigue, incredible muscle loss and weight loss, or I should say, fat loss, and essentially sort of wasted away. And this is especially true for infants and those who were kept in NICU care, many of whom experienced the symptoms of malnutrition in utero, or their mothers were also very malnourished and unable to either nurse or care for them directly after birth. This gets into a legal territory of preventing birth, I suppose, of preventing I get the preventing birth. You know what? I actually will stop between going down that route, because this gets into a different area of a crime of genocide, which I think is outside the scope of this presentation. But I will simply state that the prevention of children from growing older, especially from infancy, is indeed not only a war crime, but contradicts many principles of international law, and indeed starts to enter into this territory of the crime of genocide, which I will highlight later. One thing I also want to mention is that many of our field researchers were able to document stories of children who had already acute medical problems. So several children that we spoke with had underlying diseases or allergies, especially allergies to wheat and soy, which as food was completely cut off. Any sort of aid that was able to get in was often wheat or soy, or sometimes lactose. And for these children, almost no remedy existed. And it kind of, their health, immensely deteriorated to the point of course, starvation. I will just highlight one particular case study of Hassan that I think is very useful to kind of illustrate this point, because this took place in June. His death, which took place in June 24th of this year. His organ failures, of course, arose from severe malnutrition, even after he was admitted to hospital. And this was his, I suppose, malnutrition was starting to develop in the weeks prior to this, and his family sought medical attention. But they experienced multiple displacements, obviously over the last 15 months, but especially even within the weeks leading up to his admittance to a hospital. His family spoke about trying to go to aid clinics, to hospital after hospital, only to be turned away by bombardments, by essentially stating that the hospital did not have capacity to take on a malnourished child, considering all of the other atrocities they were trying to prevent, and health issues they were trying to assist in the betterment of. And this essentially led to such a progressive decline that was entirely preventable. I mean, his mother describes him just sort of fading away in his arms, just slowly dying. And this was before his third year birthday. I suppose this sort of illustrates the point that this malnutrition and this starvation was an intentional decision of Israel's policies to ensure that any sort of life-giving aid did not enter Gaza, subjecting mass amounts of people to starvation, especially children, which indeed amounts to torture. I want to highlight something briefly here, that obviously I am speaking about this in the context of the past 2 years within Gaza, but it should be noted that this also transfers to detention. And of course, we've heard a lot about the torture that happens within detention facilities. But this has indeed ramped up since October 7th. Our documentation shows indeed that hundreds of children who have been detained in Israeli detention facilities and prisons indeed are not being served adequate food, often moldy food, non-potable water, and are, of course, being withheld food as a form of punishment while detained. And this sort of intentional deprivation of food, again, contradicts multiple laws, international humanitarian law and human rights law, but also amounts to torture, especially regarding the Convention on the Rights of Children. Excuse me. One case in particular I'd like to highlight is the case of Walid, which is he was a 17-year-old child who died in Israeli custody this March. Now, according to our documentation on behalf of DCIP, this is the first child fatality in Israeli detention facilities since we began taking numbers in 2008. Of course, this might well have been changed in recent months, but so far all we know is that Walid indeed died within Megiddo prison on fat wasting, of course, scabies and abrasions. We heard about this earlier, and essentially, that due to his colon inflammation, much of his dehydration that we could see in his autopsy was likely due to diarrhea and essentially acute malnutrition. Again, his autopsy, which was done in Tel Aviv, believe it or not, highlighted that this was extreme and lightly prolonged malnutrition. This is simply, this is a shocking case for its severity, but again, it must be stated that deprivation of food is the norm within Israeli detention facilities and continues to be so today. I will briefly sort of just mention, I have said this, there is nothing legal about what Israel has done. And indeed, it has been functioning with complete impunity. And these acts sort of serve to highlight that these acts are not ever allowed, especially regarding children, under international law, and indeed sort of show the scale to which Israel has intentionally committed these crimes. In our submission, we very much linked much of the statements that were made by Israeli officials to the actions on the ground, to highlight that this, again, from the beginning, was an intentional choice to use starvation as a weapon of war, to induce mass starvation, and indeed to torture and collectively punish the Palestinian population. This collective punishment, again, illegal under international law, essentially seeks to prevent and stifle any form of resistance or collective action from Palestinian people, and indeed serves to essentially scar an entire generation of Palestinians to ensure that their development is stifled. And they do this from a physical standpoint. As I'm sure many of you are aware, and as we highlight in our report, malnutrition greatly stifles a healthy development of a human, not only physiologically, but also neurologically. And many of the mental health struggles that has been discussed earlier in this presentation often begin with an unhealthy development at an infant level. A lot of these children are growing up not only missing limbs and organs, but having acute malnourishment that has lasted for years. And this was an intentional policy that amounts essentially to the crime of genocide under international law. I guess to sort of close, I will simply highlight the fact that much of this torture at a societal level has been allowed by impunity and essentially silenced by international communities. And I think, torture and genocide are all Jus Cogens crimes, which essentially means that all states have a legal obligation to prevent this. And this is nothing new. This is something that has been instigated since the beginning of the United Nations. Ultimately, states have failed Palestine, and it has done so in full view of the world in seeing this deprivation of children. I will also highlight, I've tried to pin down specific statistics and numbers to kind of illustrate the malnutrition and starvation within Gaza. And of course, numbers are over the place, much because a lot of the reporting has been stifled. But at least UNICEF, as of August, which is obviously quite a while ago now, documents or submits that over 14,000 children have acute malnutrition. And these are numbers that have been demonstrated within the last several years. So any sort of suggestion that ignorance is really out the door. And of course, I'll kind of include our recommendations in our submissions. What I will essentially just highlight is that Palestinians were subjected to torture at a societal level by Israel's use of starvation as a weapon of war, and indeed as a method of torture. And this was done indeed to not only stifle the Palestinian people and ensure that their development is not a healthy one, essentially eradicating an entire generation of Palestinians, but also as a form of show to the rest of the world at Israel's colonial power and ability to commit extreme atrocities in full view of the world with complete impunity. And with that, I thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation of heartbreaking facts from the region. I would like to invite questions from the floor. And until we have the first question, maybe it would be useful if you clarify you mentioned that Israel's starvation policy qualifies as torture and amounts to genocide. maybe you could clarify the relationship between the crime of torture and the crime of genocide, perhaps both generally and in this context.
Yeah, that's a great question. So torture is quite broadly interpreted in international law. The term torture essentially means any act by which causing severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental. And in previous case law, it has been applied quite broadly to indeed include acts of torture, mass deprivation of food, and kind of on a systemic level. Where this fits into genocide is for genocide, you need to essentially have two things: intention and acts. And one of the acts that qualify as an act of genocide is the the prevention of, I guess, a generation of people or of a group of people from continuing from, existing. It also includes preventing life-giving aid and a sort of preventing the healthy development of individuals. So I guess with our submission, we sort of link the intentionality through both statements by public policy officials as well as actions of the state in withholding that aid to come together to prove not only the crime of genocide, but indeed systemic torture.
Thank you very much. We have thanks for Nora Swios to the first three presenters for excellent presentations. Maybe I can continue until we have a question from the floor. We have talked in all three presentations about the documentation and some of the documentation difficulties and documenting starvation, both the fact that starvation is there and the impact of starvation is also a challenge. Who do you think, and you mentioned the DCI Palestine documenters also facing great challenges. So who are in fact or should be the key actors and the key sources to make sure that we have an effective and judicially sufficient documentation of starvation?
I think that's an excellent question. I think in the case of Gaza, I mean, we have to remember that UNRWA essentially, in a way, functioned as the sort of intermediary to be the one to sort of take documentations, be able to be an external international entity that is, I suppose, aiding local bodies in taking this data. And Israel, of course, intentionally removed and blocked and deemed terrorist that entire entity. So I think the question is not on a lack of ability to document these things because of their actors. It's because those who were meant to document were intentionally stripped away from the scene. And of course, I'm sure we're all quite aware of the targeting of journalists at the hands of Israel, again, to narrow our ability and prevent our ability to document these crimes. I think it's come out recently as well that Meta, the company, has worked with the Israeli government to take down several videos and sort of digital evidence of actions of torture, of beatings, and indeed of starvation and the malnutrition in refugee camps around Gaza. So again, I think the sort of last line of defense are people on the ground, are field researchers who do this work, even though they themselves are facing the same sort of systemic challenges. Many of our field researchers themselves were experiencing malnutrition or family members that had extreme caloric deficiencies and were facing death by starvation while trying to document this. So I think it's sort of illustrative of the larger systemic intention behind this action.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kathryn. This was really a heartbreaking session, but very important too. And we had just a last-minute questions from Abu Bakr Juma. Abu Bakr, you have the floor, please.
Hello, everyone. Hello?
Yes, you're on. Please put your question.
Yes, my question is, as a frontline person who documents cases in those areas of Gaza, what are some of the strategies the frontline people are using to document these cases without exposing themselves to the Israeli regime? Noting that the regime, if they're not you documenting, I believe you'll be in trouble. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's a great question, and I unfortunately don't have a good answer for you, because I suppose the answer is that they do very much expose themselves to that kind of danger. And I think as an organization, we do our best to sort of keep the anonymity of our field researchers of the utmost priority. We indeed try to ensure that the child themselves remain either anonymous, or that we have consent with parents and families for their stories to be told. But to be honest, I think it's a difficult thing to have to do easily, or even to do necessarily always the right way, especially when you're operating in a context such as this. There is such mass violence and an extreme displacement that I think trying to document testimonies becomes sort of the priority, and frankly, maybe the only thing that we can do. I think as many of our systematic support networks sort of get cut off, and many of those who do this kind of work are, be labeled terrorists, or indeed being sanctioned by governments, the best you can really do is do what you can in this environment. And our field researchers certainly embody that kind of dedication to maintaining this testimony, which I think is what makes it so important to highlight, even if we can't quantify it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kathryn Ravey, for an excellent presentation and very interesting Q&A. We now move to the last presentation, and I believe we all know the last presenter very well. He has a very long resume, and I will try to mention only the very most important issues. Pau Pérez is a medical doctor, psychiatrist. He holds a PhD. He's the director of Universidad Complutense de Madrid's postdoctoral degree in mental health in political violence and catastrophe. He's a clinician at the Department of Psychiatry Hospital La Paz in Madrid, and the director of CIRA, the Center for Research, Forensic Documentation and Rehabilitation of Ill Treatment and Torture Victims. Pau has defined the concept of torturing environments, and he has developed a set of tools to quantify and to study torturing environments, referred to in his many articles, and not the least in the book Psychological Torture. In the context of today, Dr. Pérez is the highly respected editor-in-chief of Torture Journal, and Pau will present his editorial for the special issue, namely One Occupation, Two Realities, Psychological Mechanisms that Make Genocidal Acts Possible. Pau, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jens. Well, this special issue of Torture Journal is a collective effort, and I want to, before anything, thank all the team behind the journal. You have, I think, an incredible collection of papers, as Jen said in the introduction, and I think, well, I expect it will give a lot of material for thinking, for advocacy, and also for justice. I will try to summarize the editorial. Not an easy task. There is a lot of material inside it, and I want to make clear from the beginning that all what I will try to share, it's based on facts and figures, on experimental data backed by reflections and references. So it's not my opinion. It tries to be a summary of what we can find from decades of research on the Israeli occupation of Gaza, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, if you have a look at the special section, you will see that the word genocide appears more than 500 times along the 15 papers. And the question is there a genocide debate? We have heard in the presentations, in the three presentations we had before, appealing data. And I think that almost all United Nations and main international NGOs, and even I would say Israeli human rights organizations, has considered what is happening as a genocide. So I think there is little doubt that what is happening is a genocide. And I think it's important we reflect on the word genocide, because there is a risk, in my humble view, of banalizing the word genocide. We are so used to hear it in media, to read it in papers and news, that we don't really capture the deep meaning of what genocide means. Is the extinction of people for political reasons. And I want to begin by recovering that idea and putting that idea in value. We have many data. I will not go on that, on why we consider that there is a genocide in Gaza. I strongly recommend to read the statement by International Association of Genocide Scholars, that I think it's a wonderful summary of why this is a genocide, by those who I think most know about genocide. So the question is the Israeli population aware of this? And this is probably an unusual topic to talk about. Just looking at the other side, we hear a lot about the suffering of people, but let's think about that. Is the Israeli population aware of this? What do they think? Do we have data? And this is the question we wanted to answer first in the editorial. And we have many surveys, many surveys. Surprisingly enough, many people inside Israel has done polls and surveys trying to answer these questions, and the results are shocking. And I will just share some of these results. For instance, 79%, almost 80% of Jewish Israelis are not so or not at all troubled by reports of famine and suffering in Gaza. "60% of Israelis agreed that there are no innocents in Gaza." These are surveys by university centers, wide samples, and with good methodological background. 39% of Israeli people think that Israel's response in Gaza is about right, and 34% not far enough. Those are shocking results. 68% of Jewish Israelis opposed allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza, even being non-United Nations humanitarian channels. Or 70% of Jewish Israelis said they trust the Israeli military reports on Palestinian casualties to a very large extent, or fairly large extent. While most Arab Israelis think that they are not a reliable source. In September 2025, so not that long ago, around 60% of Jewish Israel supported cleansing Gaza and removing its Palestinian population. In another poll, 69 to 72% support exiling or removing Gazans from Gaza, even by force. So it's important to understand the context in which the genocide is taking place. Is not just a question of political leaders. There is also support from white layers of the society. In a very questioned poll in June 2025, 50% of people expressed support for acting like Joshua in Jericho, killing all inhabitants of a conquered city in Gaza. It was questioned because of the formulation of the questions, which were in biblical terms, but the results are solid because it was replicated sometime later and the results were pretty similar. So how do we explain that? How do we explain that? Which is the explanation for people that has suffered a genocide and now are supporting this kind of policies? Which is the explanation? What can psychology, psychiatry, sociology, history try to put into the debate? Of course, we should not deny what the October 7 attacks mean. We are not denying what means the killing of people, large-scale killing. We are not denying what means the abduction of civilians. We are not denying what means the suffering in terms of PTSD, depression. We have studies on that. And we are not denying that. We're putting the focus now in the support of the Israeli population to what happened after that, because in our understanding, any human suffering can justify a genocide. And this is the point of the part. We are not denying the suffering of everybody, but no suffering can justify a genocide. So there are many, many elements that all interplay, mix, and mutually potentiate to explain how this is possible, how the figures we saw, the shocking figures we show, can be understood. We will go from the individual to the global in a systemic perspective. Many of the people in the audience probably know that there are many studies supporting what I show you. There is a denial or minimization of Palestinian suffering. We saw in the surveys how people is not interested in the suffering population. They are not interested in being provided news. They are not interested in seeing images. There is a dehumanization. Palestinians are portrayed as evil or inherently dangerous. Children are terrorists. And there are victim blaming narratives. They brought it on themselves. And of course, we'll see this later, there is a self-serving information selection. You choose where do you want to get information and which channel of TV or which news journal do you want to read. And a study, and well, there are many studies that support the idea of hierarchies of victimhood. The idea that, let's say, you are an historical victim, and the idea that you are a victim gives you the moral right to do anything, to perpetrate anything, because you are the victim in capital letters. So this idea of exclusive Jewish victimhood frames, I'm summarizing a lot, but there are different models to understand that based on experimental studies and theoretical debates. Of course, there are affective motivational drivers. There is fear, there is rage, there is existential threat. We have a study showing that a part of the population has strong emotions, and these emotions, of course, trigger the search for security and the support to hard line in measures. And also the political discourse that show the final victory is almost there helps or predicts in experimental studies support for extreme work policies. There are also group dynamics, collective identity. When a group of people is under chronic threat, there is an intensified in group identification. You feel more like belonging to your group because this gives security to you. And we saw, and there is also a study supporting that the glorification of the Jewish Israeli in-group as being superior to other groups and entitled to having collective privileges also provides support for these extreme positions. There are religious and nationalist myths that are recovered and are presented in media, reinforcing grandiosity and invulnerability of the Jewish people. And we know from social psychology studies that when a group is highly polarized, then you can discuss on extreme ideas, and there is a normalization of ideas that could not be put in the debate before this polarization. So extreme ideas become normal. You can discuss on everything, and they are every time more popular. Okay, this is not something that comes from the last 5 years. There is many decades in which all this climate has been growing. There are studies showing that the school curriculum textbooks transmit a biased historical narrative of the Palestine land. Military service is an essential element to understand also the fact that it's a prolonged military service, that many population is a reservist, and there is a kind of military side citizenship. The military have a special valued role in the society. Settlements, the role of settlements, and also what we could call shared beliefs. And there are different models I just showed too, the ethos of conflict and the perpetual in-group victimhood, both as models supported by experimental studies. I will not go in detail in them, but both show a shared identity in which we live in conflict, we have to defend themselves, and all what happens around is interpreted in terms of victimhood, in terms of being in a conflict and the need to defend yourself against everything, everybody. The power of media. The discourses discrediting United Nations, discrediting human rights organizations. There are campaigns against Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and also against Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, etc., showing them as biased or showing them as being prone to terrorism and to pro-Palestine positions. The use of euphemistic language in which people who is killed are casualties, in which hospital are terrorist bases and doctors are terrorist leaders, which again normalize and even makes necessary the bombing or the military actions towards civilian places. The silencing and targeting of journalism. More than 200 journalists have been killed in Gaza in the last 2 years. And of course, there are wide networks which try to change public opinion worldwide through social networks, and with Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and so on, profiles that try to influence, that act in public discussion groups, trying to give information or disinformation that supports Israeli position. There is an enormous invest of resources in that. Again, this is supported by research and reference, is not an opinion. Okay, the use of lawfare. The strategic use of law, and of course we know a lot about that. There are 2 papers on that in the special section on how law is used to legitimize coercive practice. We know from social psychology that when people think that something is legal, in spite is not ethical, correct, but it's legal, then people support it. So making everything legal is a way also to make this acceptable for the population. Adopt laws that provide support for administrative detention, for incommunicado detention, for all the, let's say, not respecting the minimum rights of detainees or the population in a normal democratic country. And structural impunity. There are different reports showing how from 1,200 complaints against soldiers for human rights wrongdoings, just 20 cases have been put into courts, and just 1 case there was an administrative sanction, not a penal sanction. So impunity is part of the system. An historical trauma, and I know this is a complex and political topic, and it's important to acknowledge the historical suffering, and it's important to acknowledge that there are a lot of sensibilities on this, but with the utmost respect for this suffering. But there are many Israeli researchers, Israeli students that have reflected on how the Holocaust memory and the suffering of the Holocaust survivors has been used for political legitimation of Israeli policies, and how there is a weaponization of anti-Semitism to silence criticism of Israeli policy. And again, this is a reflection coming from inside Israel, from people who does not agree with this. And finally, going to the top, going to the macro perspective, and again, these are a theory-informative hypotheses derived from conflict studies on Israel and Palestine, and of course discussable. Wartime mobilization can mute corruption and socioeconomic crisis. So also related to internal Israel policy. Also competition within the right parties to appear thoughter on security. The industry, the military industry, which is one of the main industries in the country, and also the hostage crisis as a legitimacy challenge for leaders, and a way to, increase popularity in a context where there is a lot of internal debate on how the hostage crisis has been managed. And finally, there are international incentives. There are Palestinian factional struggles, and Israel takes advantage of that. US domestic politics, and all the economic implications of the war and the reconstruction, and also the historical European guild that provides an almost unconditional support to Israeli policies. So what I try to say is that if we try to understand why is this genocide happening, there are so many reasons that go from the individual, from the citizen, from the family, the group, to the politics, and to the wider international landscape, and they are all intertwined, and they potentially mutually. The discourse of politicians, of course, affects population, and of course, media interacts with this, and there are economic interests and so on. The solution requires this comprehensive perspective and requires not thinking that just by addressing one of these aspects, it will be enough. This is just to show how we have briefly gone through all these mechanisms and how complex is it. Complex doesn't mean that you cannot try to work on it. Complexity doesn't mean impossible too. It means that you need a lot of reflection and not simplistic solutions. So I think it's important to understand how there has been a process from trauma to moral erosion. Let me call it that way. How somehow the polls, the surveys show that October 7, it's the ending point probably of something that has been growing for decades. And now there is a closer revenge and defensive nationalism, and extreme ideas which were shared by small groups now move into mainstream public discourse. And there is not only a banalization of Gaza suffering has become, for some people, a spectacle, a show, and part of. And I want to stress that, of course, even in this context, there is dissent. There are Israeli human rights organizations that document things, even being the target of threats or being the target of accusations, and their work must be acknowledged. And also the work of the Palestinian organizations who document in very complex and difficult situations. And in this context where many people think why to give testimony if no one hears, if, as we saw in Israel, they don't want to hear about the Palestinian suffering, they don't seem to be moved about that or testimonies. And of course, it's necessary to document, but knowing the context, one must think, document for what and how the reality, what we are getting, is possible to, break this wall of silence, this wall of, and to reach the ones who would like to hear or to be more aware of what's happening. So there is a situation in which academia must document, must challenge dominant narratives, and probably you have to work at different levels. There is the micro level, confronting dehumanization, the misuse of trauma, and trying to think on that and to be clear on that. But of course, there is a macro level, ending occupation and ensuring accountability as prerequisites for sustainable peace. So there is no sustainable peace without ending the occupation and the siege regime imposed on Palestinians. We need robust accountability mechanism, and probably we need to put the focus, as the first presentation we had today, not on trauma, but on this global context, and to think that the only way to deal with the mental health consequences of the genocide is equal rights, self-determination, and guarantees of non-repetition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pau. Not encouraging when we think about a peaceful two-state solution, I must say. But this is the hardcore realities we have to face. We have only 3 minutes left, and we need some time for closing as well. But we have one quick question from Nora Sveos. It was actually addressed in one of the last slides, but Nora, would you like to ask your question anyway, and perhaps have a quick answer from Pau?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Pau, for this very strong presentation. Actually, you said more about it after I had presented the question, because you did say talk about the shrinking space for dissent. So I was wondering about the human rights defenders in Israel and those who you mentioned who are defending. So see if you have time for very brief, but you already did mention it. So thank you very much again.
Yeah, thank you, Nora. How a 1 minute reply?
Well, no, but there is one reflection I would like to do. We have put the focus on how the Israeli population is reacting to conflict, and we don't have data, unfortunately, on what happens to the Palestinian population. And I think it would be important also to have the other perspective, to have studies to try to understand how collectively the Palestinian population is reacting to the genocide. And I'm not able to predict what we would find. As the other speaker has said, humiliation is a core element in what is, and probably humiliation helps to explain, on the one hand, resilience, on the other hand, probably the support of most of the population to what their leaders are doing, trying to, manage the situation. I think that in a very complex context as we are, besides documenting the human rights violations and besides documenting the mental health impact, it would be important to document the psychological mechanism behind the response of the Palestinian population, to have the whole landscape on how is this interacting.
Thank you very much, Pau, also for all your work in making this special issue a reality. It is an unprecedented publication, I think. I would like to hand over the floor to Berta, and thank all participants and presenters for sticking to the time.
Thank you so much, Jens, for moderating this session. And thank you again for the speakers, Samah, Kathryn, Maha, Pau, for these excellent presentations. We will make sure the presentations are circulated and also available on our FABO platform, as well as the recording. And we will most probably also do one of these insights, which is a 15 to 20 minute short summary of the highlights of this session. So yeah, and as you can see, there's a poll popping up on your screen, which we really appreciate if you can submit the responses to these 3 quick questions. Also, because as I said at the beginning, the intention is to continue providing these sessions focusing on the Torture Journal upcoming editions. We're thinking about 1 per year, but feel free to also send us your feedback on how you, if you think this session was helpful, and you want to have more in the future. But yeah, with that, again, thank you all who prioritized this meeting today, and the interpreters as well for their amazing work, speakers, and last but not least, Jens, for moderating. Thank you so much. If you want to go on